The standard narrative frames this event as a betrayal of trust between two allies. The reality is far colder and more strategic. Washington didn't hide the deal to deceive Jerusalem. They hid it because showing Israel the final text would have triggered an immediate, irreversible military escalation that would have collapsed the negotiations before Tehran was ready to sign. In late 2025 and early 2026, following a 12-day war where U.S.-Israeli strikes decimated Iran's missile arsenal but failed to topple the regime, Washington faced a critical strategic contradiction in Israeli deterrence policy. Israel demanded total victory, while the U.S. needed a frozen nuclear program and open oil flows. By denying Prime Minister Netanyahu access to the specific negotiation terms prior to the June 19 signing ceremony, the White House preserved its own leverage. Full transparency would have forced Tehran's hand into an immediate escalation they were not ready for, shattering the fragile ceasefire that had just been established in April. This was not a lack of trust. It was a calculated move to prevent a fatal flaw in deterrence from turning a diplomatic victory into a total war. To understand why this secrecy became a strategic necessity, we must look at how the landscape shifted after President Trump's second inauguration on January 25. The divergence between Washington and Jerusalem was not immediate but grew sharp over months of conflicting objectives. While Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered military preparations for preemptive strikes by mid-2025, prioritizing kinetic solutions rooted in historical precedents like the 1981 Iraq strike or the 2007 Syria strike, the White House adopted a hybrid approach combining sanctions with diplomatic outreach. The administration explicitly stated that success should be measured by wars we never get into. On March 7, 2025, Washington sent a formal letter to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei offering negotiations within a 2-month window, aiming to prevent proliferation without direct conflict. This marked the beginning of a fundamental split in strategy where Israel sought regime security through destruction while the U.S. pursued stability and oil flow continuity. Quick resource note: I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. The catalyst for this secrecy emerged during the intense fighting that began in late 2025 and culminated in what became known as the 12-Day War. By April 8, 2026, following over a month of combat, a fragile 2-week ceasefire was agreed upon between Washington and Tehran. However, the strategic landscape remained volatile. Iran's missile capabilities were severely degraded by U.S.-Israeli strikes throughout late 2025 and early 2026, but its leadership structure had shifted dramatically. Following attacks on March 1, 2026, which resulted in the death of Ali Khamenei and other senior officials under a joint operation, hardline elements under Mojtaba Khamenei took control. This shift created a volatile environment where any perceived weakness could trigger an immediate response from Tehran that would undo months of diplomatic progress. The core tension emerged regarding transparency. The analysis indicates that a fatal contradiction existed within Israeli deterrence policy. Israel's historical reliance on total military victory clashed with the diplomatic reality needed to secure an agreement. If Washington had shared specific deal details, such as the scope of sanctions relief or nuclear enrichment limits, with Jerusalem prior to the signing, it would have exposed this contradiction immediately. The logic is that if a partner sees concessions being made by their ally, they lose faith in the threat of further escalation and may reject any compromise that looks like an American win. This creates what analysts call a credibility trap, where threats are blunted because the adversary knows the threatening party has domestic political constraints or strategic limits on ground troop casualties. On June 15, 2026, the U.S. announced a framework agreement. Iran pledged never to acquire nuclear weapons in exchange for $12 billion in frozen assets and sanctions relief, with a 60-day ceasefire and reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. The signing was scheduled for Geneva on June 19. Crucially, Washington denied Israel access to view these specific terms beforehand. This denial served two strategic functions that were vital for the survival of the deal. First, it preserved leverage by preventing an immediate Israeli escalation that would have forced Tehran's hand before they were ready to negotiate. Second, it protected deterrence logic by withholding details that would force a choice between total war and an unacceptable diplomatic compromise. The result was a deal that secured U.S. economic interests ahead of the November midterms, but left Israel facing domestic pressure without the anticipated total victory. This highlights that sometimes strategic silence is more effective than alliance transparency. The denial prevented Iran from seeing the concessions as weakness, which would have triggered a new wave of conflict capable of closing the Strait of Hormuz again. Such a scenario carries global oil price implications and potential for direct superpower confrontation. If Washington had shown Israel the deal, Iran likely would have rejected it immediately upon seeing U.S. concessions, triggering a cycle that could have collapsed the entire diplomatic effort before Tehran was ready to sign. This explains why two nations with such deep intelligence sharing would publicly clash over a secret meeting. It shifts the viewer's understanding from an emotional narrative of betrayal to a structural analysis of incentive incompatibility. For the curious viewer, this matters because it reveals that in high-stakes geopolitics, transparency is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is a liability. Alliances are held together by shared interests, not just trust. When those interests diverge, U.S. wants to burge. U.S. wants stability and oil flows versus Israel wants regime security. The stronger party will prioritize its own strategic calculus over alliance harmony to avoid catastrophic failure. The lesson here is that in the realpolitik of nuclear negotiations, secrecy can be a tool for de-escalation rather than deception. The question remains whether this temporary silence will hold or if it sows seeds for future conflict as Israel faces its own domestic election pressures without total victory. But for now, the decision by Washington to deny access served its purpose, keeping the war from restarting before Tehran was ready to sign and securing a critical diplomatic breakthrough that would have otherwise been lost in a firestorm of military escalation. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.